Have you ever been so humiliated you wanted to disappear? It wasn't the $10 I lacked that day, it was the last ounce of dignity I had left. But somehow, in that moment of despair, a stranger stepped forward, and everything started to change. The conveyor belt clattered beneath a loaf of wheat bread, a few apples, a bag of rice, and a box of tea. The cashier barely looked up, her nails clicking impatiently across the touchscreen. "That'll be $32.87, she said, chewing gum like she hated the job, and everyone in line. Grace reached into her coat pocket where she kept an envelope of carefully folded bills. She always paid in cash. Always counted twice. But today, her stomach dropped. She was short. By exactly $10. No mistake. She remembered now, Lily, her youngest, had needed feminine hygiene products yesterday. She'd picked them up quickly and forgotten to subtract them from today's total. I can put something back, Grace murmured. The cashier sighed loudly, looking over her shoulder at the growing line. "Well? What's it gonna be?" A man behind her huffed. A woman muttered something about holding up the line. Grace's fingers hovered over the tea. She'd go without. Her girls wouldn't say a word, but they'd know. Then a voice behind her, quiet, firm. "Leave it." A hand reached past her, sliding a crisp $10 bill onto the counter. Not a flashy gesture, not smug. Just calm and deliberate. The cashier snatched the money. "Next," she barked. Grace turned, stunned. The man was older, 60s maybe, silver hair, gray wool coat. Not expensive, but tailored. Not rich-looking, but composed. The kind of man people didn't look past. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice cracking despite herself. "I know," he said, with a soft smile. "That's why I did." She swallowed hard. "Thank you. Truly." He nodded. "It's cold out. You and your kids deserve something warm to eat." How did you know I have kids?" He didn't answer, just smiled again. That kind of smile you only wear when you've lost a lot and learned what matters. Outside, the wind was sharp and biting. Slush piled up along the sidewalks. Grace shifted the grocery bag in her arms as he walked beside her, silent. "I hope I didn't come off rude," she said finally. I'm not used to strangers helping." "You weren't rude," he said. "You were just a mother, doing her best." They paused near a bus stop. She adjusted her coat, hesitating. "May I ask your name?" she said. "Richard." "I'm Grace." He gave a small nod. "I'd offer you a ride, but I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable." "I wouldn't be," she replied. "But you've done enough already." "You're not a burden," Richard said, unlocking a black sedan parked nearby. It was discreet, clean, almost too elegant for the street they were on. Inside, the car smelled like cedar and leather. A small driver ID hung from the dash. This wasn't new wealth. This was old, measured generosity. On the ride, she told him. About her husband, Mark. About the construction site. About how she buried an empty coffin 5 years ago. "I never stopped believing he might come back," she whispered. "Even when I knew he wouldn't." Richard didn't interrupt. He just listened. Not with pity, she could smell that a mile away, but with presence. After a moment, he said, "Let me help. If you'll let me." The car's heater filled the silence with a low hum as they moved through the city's gray arteries. Outside, the streets blurred past, gas stations, shuttered storefronts, a playground covered in snow. Inside, Grace sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying not to feel out of place. "Are you sure this isn't too much trouble?" she asked again. Richard gave her a side glance. "Grace, I'm old enough to know the difference between inconvenience and purpose. This isn't trouble. She didn't quite know how to respond to that. Most people helped with a look that said they expected something in return, even if it was just gratitude. Richard didn't look at her like that. He looked at her the way you look at someone carrying a weight you've carried before. She gave him directions to her building, a low-rise on the far edge of the city. The kind of place with cracked stairwells and neighbors who didn't make eye contact. When they pulled up to the curb, Grace hesitated before opening the door. "Would you," she began, then stopped herself. Richard waited. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I can't offer much, but I owe you at least that." "I'd be honored," he said without hesitation. The apartment was small but clean. The smell of vanilla candles tried to compete with the faint scent of damp walls. Grace ushered him inside, nudging aside a pair of tiny snow boots in the hallway. "Girls," she called. "We have a guest." From the bedroom, two pairs of wide eyes peeked out, Lily and Anna, ages 9 and 7. Behind them, her twins, Zoe and Mia, 5, peeked from behind a curtain like miniature spies. "Don't be shy," Grace said gently. "Come say hi." They shuffled forward cautiously, curious but polite. "This is Mr. Richard. He helped Mommy at the store today." Richard knelt slightly. "It's very nice to meet you ladies. You must be very brave to let your mom go out alone on a day like this." The girls giggled softly. Lily, always the bold one, stepped closer. "Do you know how to fix toasters?" Richard chuckled. "Not anymore. I used to be better at fixing people." Grace raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Later, after the kids settled with coloring books, she poured them both cups of instant coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You said you used to fix people," she said. "What did you mean?" Richard stirred his coffee, as if the answer needed time to rise. "I used to be a doctor. Cardiology. Retired now." She blinked. "So, what made you stop?" "My wife died. 2 years ago." His voice didn't crack. It was past the raw stage, settled now into something cold and well-worn. "And then, a year later, my son disappeared. I think grief swallowed him whole." "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Did he?" "He left no note. No trail. Just silence." He paused. "Sometimes I think it would have been easier if I had buried an empty coffin like you did. At least then I'd have something to put flowers on." Grace swallowed hard. The room was quiet except for the hum of the radiator. "What made you stop today?" she asked. Richard looked up. "Because when I saw you, I saw someone who hadn't given up. And I thought, if she's still fighting, maybe I should be too." She felt her throat tighten. No one ever said things like that to her. Not friends, not neighbors. Not even family. "I don't want to be a charity case," she said after a while. "You're not," Richard said firmly. "You're a mother doing what it takes. That's not charity. That's grace." When he left that evening, the girls waved from the window, their tiny hands fogging up the glass. Grace watched him cross the street, disappear into the quiet snow. She didn't know then that this man, this stranger, had already decided to change everything. Richard drove in silence for a long time after leaving Grace's apartment. The heater whirred, the city lights blurred into gold and gray, but he barely noticed. Her words echoed in his mind, "I buried an empty coffin, but never buried hope." He hadn't felt moved like that in years. At home, his apartment was spacious, minimalist, untouched by time or warmth. The only sign of life was a large photograph on the wall, a black and white image of a boy and a woman, both smiling with full, untouched innocence. His son. His wife. He poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. Instead, He opened a drawer in his study and pulled out a file he hadn't looked at in over a year. Inside, a missing persons report, old newspaper clippings, and a photograph of his son, Ethan. Taken the day before he disappeared. Richard stared at the photo. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from a dormant grief waking up. Ethan had been a construction foreman. Reliable. Quiet. The type to shoulder burdens without complaint. Just like Grace's husband, Mark. Could it be? No. He shook his head. Don't do that to yourself again. Don't invent ghosts. But still. The next morning, Richard made a call to an old contact. Jackson? It's been a while. I need someone found. Maybe. It's delicate. Jackson laughed gruffly. You always come to me when it's delicate. Who is it this time? A man. Mid-30s. Used to work in construction. Went missing about 5 years ago. Name was Mark Bennett. There was a pause on the other end. You think he's alive? I don't know. But a mother of 4 buried an empty coffin and still looks like she's waiting for him to walk through the door. Jackson exhaled slowly. You want me to take the case? I want you to try, Richard said. And I'll pay whatever it costs. Just find out if he's out there. Later that day, Richard returned to the grocery store where he had met Grace. He walked through the aisles slowly, deliberately. The place was mundane, but it had become sacred in his memory. A reminder that life-altering moments don't come with warning signs, they sneak up between boxes of cereal and the hum of fluorescent lights. At the checkout lane, he saw the same cashier. She didn't notice him until he spoke. You remember the woman from yesterday? She was short $10. The cashier blinked. Yeah, I guess. Why? She didn't deserve to be embarrassed like that. The woman gave a half-hearted shrug. It's not my job to. Richard slid a $100 bill across the counter. The next 10 women who come through short, cover it. Tell them someone already paid. The cashier gawked. Are you serious? I am. He turned to leave, then paused. And maybe next time, look someone in the eye before you assume they're just another inconvenience. Back at his office, Richard sat at his desk staring at an open email draft. Subject, Donation Proposal, Bennett Family Relief Trust. He wasn't sure what he was building just yet. A foundation? A scholarship fund? A safety net for mothers like Grace? It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was finally doing something. Helping meant more than signing checks, it meant restoring dignity. And that started with one woman who still believed her husband might come home. He clicked save. For now. That night, he made another call. Jackson? When you start digging, cross-reference missing Mark Bennett with construction sites, hospitals, clinics, anything within a 200-mile radius. Focus on shelters, too. Why? Because if he's alive, he might not remember who he is. Jackson Hart wasn't your typical private investigator. He didn't wear trench coats or sit in parked cars eating donuts. He was a retired homicide detective with a bad knee and an excellent memory. He was also one of the few people Richard trusted completely. By the end of the week, Jackson had set up a temporary office in the spare room of his modest home, whiteboards already filled with notes and pins connected by red thread. He was old school, but efficient. Your guy, Jackson said during their first debrief, Mark Bennett. Went missing from a job site 5 years ago. Riverway Development Project. There was a crane malfunction, a collapse. Emergency responders pulled out 3 bodies, all identified. Mark's body was never found, but they assumed he drowned. His wallet was recovered, but no ID inside. So they buried a box of clothes, Richard muttered. Jackson nodded. Basically, the case went cold after a month. No credit cards used. No bank activity. No contact. But he flipped a page. A man matching his description was seen last year at a free clinic 2 towns over. No name. No ID. Staff said he seemed confused, didn't know his address. Left before anyone could help. Richard leaned in. Do we have a photo? Not from the clinic. But I've got one from a shelter in East Point taken 6 months ago. The man didn't give a name, but he turned his laptop and hit play. A grainy surveillance clip loaded. The image showed a tall man in worn jeans and a flannel coat entering the shelter, limping slightly, shoulders hunched. He looked up once, long enough for his face to catch the light. Richard's heart slammed in his chest. That's him, he whispered. You sure? Richard stared, breath shallow. I haven't seen Mark in real life. But I've seen that exact jawline. My son had the same one. Jackson raised an eyebrow. I think, Richard said carefully, Mark Bennett might be my biological son. Meanwhile, Grace continued her life in small, quiet steps. There had been no miracles. Just groceries in the cupboard. A few peaceful nights. Warm socks. The feeling that someone out there still cared. Richard hadn't visited again, but he had sent a letter, handwritten, neat cursive. Grace, I meant what I said. I want to help. Not just with money, but with finding answers. I've hired someone to look into your husband's disappearance. If there's any chance he's still alive, we'll find him. In the meantime, please let your girls know that there's one more person in this world who believes in their mom. Warmly, Richard. Grace sat on the edge of her bed that night rereading the letter. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Hope was a dangerous thing, light and sharp like glass. But she couldn't help it. She folded the letter and slipped it under her pillow like a talisman. Back in East Point, Jackson returned to the shelter where the footage had been captured. He went by to Vince, the staff manager told him. Didn't talk much. Seemed like a good guy, just lost. You could tell something wasn't right. Is he still here? The woman frowned. Left about a month ago. Said he was heading north. Something about a cold place with tall trees. That's all he said. Later that evening, Jackson called Richard. I think we're getting close. If he's who you think he is, we're not just looking for a missing man. We're looking for a man who doesn't even know who he is. The river was black that night. Not the kind of black you see in city puddles or street shadows, this was deeper. The kind that swallows. Mark hit the water with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. 1 second he was standing on the scaffold, shouting at a junior worker to back away from the crane's sway, then a snap, a groan of metal, and then nothing but air and a sickening drop. The current dragged him under instantly. He thrashed, panicked, reached for anything, rock, rebar, air, but all he found was cold and weightlessness. Something hit his head. Hard. Then silence. When he woke up, it was in a barn. His entire body ached. His head pulsed like it was trying to split open. 2 men stood over him, both weathered and reeking of tobacco and gasoline. He's awake, one said. Told you he wasn't dead. Mark tried to speak, but the only thing that came out was a hoarse rasp. Don't strain yourself, the second man muttered. You've been out for 3 days. We found you down by the rocks, looked like you'd been in the water a long while. What happened? The 2 men exchanged a look. One of them scratched his beard. That's what we were hoping you could tell us. The next few days blurred together. His memories came and went in fragments, scaffolding, the sound of snapping metal, a woman's voice yelling something, Grace, her name was Grace, but the images slipped through his mind like sand. Nothing held. When they asked his name, he hesitated. I think it's Mark, he said, unsure. The older man nodded slowly. Well, Mark, welcome back to the world. They gave him clothes, a place to rest, and pointed him toward a shelter 2 towns over. He didn't ask why they didn't take him to a hospital. Somehow, he already knew, people like them didn't trust systems. At the shelter, he introduced himself as Vince. It was the name on the shirt the drifters gave him. Every night, he stared at the ceiling, willing the memories to return. He remembered the color yellow. A girl's backpack. A lunchbox with cats. A porch with chipped paint. Laughter, high and bright. He didn't know where these images came from, but they felt like home. Mark tried to find work, but without ID, it was nearly impossible. So he swept floors at the shelter, helped repair broken furniture, and disappeared into the rhythms of the forgotten. But something had shifted recently. A man came to the shelter asking questions. Not a cop. Not social services. A detective, someone sharp. Mark, no, Vince, watched from the stairwell as the man flipped through a photo. The detective never saw him. But Mark saw the picture. It was of him. Standing next to a woman and 4 little girls, each grinning with their heads tilted at the same angle. The image hit him like a wave. That night, he dreamt of snow. Of tiny voices calling, "Daddy," and the sound of teacups clinking on chipped porcelain. He woke up gasping, fingers curled into fists. He didn't know who he was. But he knew now, someone was looking for him. And someone was waiting. Jackson's phone buzzed just past midnight. He didn't usually answer that late, but his gut told him this wasn't the kind of call you miss. Yeah. This is Carmen, said the voice on the other end, sleep rough and cautious. You left your number at East Point Shelter. Said to call if we saw that guy again? Vince? Jackson sat upright. He's there. No. But he was. For about an hour. 8, sat by the window, asked if we had any new papers lying around. Seemed different. Different how? Restless. Like he was fighting something in his head. A pause. He took a flyer. One of the missing person ones. The one with the picture you left. Jackson was silent. I think he recognized himself. The next morning, Jackson met Richard at his apartment. He looked like he hadn't slept. He's real, Jackson said, tossing down the flyer. And I think he's starting to remember. Richard stared at the wrinkled paper. The photo of Mark was centered in the middle, with the words "Have you seen this man?" printed above it. He'd stared at this picture 100 times, but this time it looked different, like the man inside it was finally stirring awake. Where is he now? Left before sunrise. Headed north again, toward the woods. Probably instinct. People with fractured memory often seek out familiar landscapes. Trees. Water. The kind of places they don't have to explain themselves. Richard exhaled slowly. We have to find him before winter hits full force. I'm working on it, Jackson said. But if he's starting to remember, he may come to you first. Grace opened her mailbox 2 days later and found a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was the missing person's flyer. Her husband's face stared back at her. But someone with a shaky hand, had scribbled 2 words across the bottom. I'm sorry. She stood on her porch, heart pounding, rereading it again and again. It wasn't just the words, it was the handwriting. She recognized it. Imperfect. Slanted left. The way Mark used to write when he was tired. Tears welled in her eyes before she even realized what was happening. She didn't know how, or when, or what would come next, but this wasn't just a hope anymore. This was a message. Jackson returned to East Point and began following the trail north. A hiker had reported seeing a man camping alone near the old fire tower trails, quiet, limping slightly, but kept to himself. That same afternoon, Jackson reached the base of the mountain and started hiking. At the edge of a frozen creek, he found a crude shelter. Empty now, but still warm from a fire. And next to the ashes, a strip of newspaper. Burned around the edges. It was the same flyer. Half-torched, but with the photo intact. Jackson's chest tightened. He whispered into the wind, "Come on, son. Don't stop now." That evening, Grace sat with her girls at the dinner table. They were loud and laughing, arguing over who got the bigger slice of pie. She watched them for a long time. And in her heart, something shifted. Because even if he didn't remember them, he was still trying to find his way back. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where snow doesn't fall gently, it scrapes sideways against the windows like wind-blown glass. Grace was folding laundry when she heard it. Not the usual knock, this one was hesitant, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they were welcome. She wiped her hands on her jeans, heart already pounding. When she opened the door, the wind blew in first. Then came a man. Tall. Gaunt. Beard slightly unkempt. But his eyes. Oh God. His eyes. "Mark," she breathed. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, as if trying to measure the reality of the moment. "I think so," he said softly. Then she was crying, holding the doorframe to steady herself as every part of her wanted to run to him, but was too afraid it was all a dream. He took a slow step forward. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know who I was. But then I saw your face. And the girls. And I remembered. It wasn't much. But it was enough." The next second, Grace collapsed into his arms. Not from weakness. From release. From 5 years of holding the world together alone. And Mark, his arms, though thin, held her like they'd never let go again. Inside, the girls stared, wide-eyed. Lily stepped forward first. "Mom?" Grace turned to them, tears still falling. "Girls," she said gently, voice trembling, "this is your dad." Zoe blinked. "But, he died." "No," Mark said, kneeling down. "I got lost." Anna touched his hand slowly, as if afraid he might vanish. "Do you remember us?" Mark looked at them with a kind of awe that broke Grace's heart all over again. "Not all the way," he said honestly. "But I'm going to." One by one, the girls moved closer, arms wrapping around him until he was buried in warmth and love and the very thing he'd forgotten he was, home. Later that evening, Richard stood across the street, leaning on his cane. He had arrived a few minutes after Grace called him. But he didn't knock. He just watched from a distance, hands in his coat pockets, breath misting in the air. He watched as the living room lights glowed, as Mark lifted Zoe onto his shoulders, as laughter spilled out into the freezing street like warmth made real. Jackson pulled up beside him. "You're not going in?" "Not yet," Richard said quietly. "You found him," Jackson said. "You helped bring him home." Richard's voice cracked a little. "He doesn't know who I am." Jackson looked at him. "Maybe not. But he will." They stood in silence for a long time. And across the street, behind glass and light and hope, a family was being made whole again. The first time Mark saw Richard up close, he didn't recognize him. They met a few days after the return, at Grace's request. She said simply, "There's someone you should meet. Someone who helped us when you couldn't." Mark, still piecing himself together, nodded. He trusted her instinct, even if his memory didn't stretch far enough to catch the shape of the past. Richard arrived at their apartment wearing his usual gray wool coat and a subtle look of fatigue that didn't quite match his usual composed posture. "Mr. Bennet," he said, extending a hand. "Welcome home." Mark took it, grip firm. "Thank you. For everything. Grace told me what you did." "You didn't have to." "I did," Richard replied. "You were never truly gone. She never stopped believing. And people like her deserve answers." There was a moment of silence between them, two men, strangers by circumstance, tethered by something neither could name yet. But Grace saw it. She saw the way Richard looked at Mark. Not just relief. Recognition. Later that week, the call came. Grace found Richard on the floor of his study. The ambulance arrived fast, but not fast enough to erase the panic from her voice as she held his hand and whispered, "Stay with me, please, just stay." At the hospital, they said the words she feared: "His condition is critical. Internal bleeding. Complications from a pre-existing illness." Grace sat in the hallway, cold coffee in her hands, Mark beside her. The doctor returned, white coat stiff with urgency. "We need a transfusion. A rare blood type, AB negative. We're searching the registry, but it's uncommon." Mark stood slowly. "Test me." Grace turned sharply. "Mark. I said test me." The doctor nodded and took him back immediately. An hour later, the results came in. Mark was a match. Not just compatible, perfect. "He's the ideal donor," the doctor said. "Down to the protein markers. It's remarkable, really." Grace blinked. "What does that mean?" The doctor shrugged. "It could mean a close genetic link. Or just an extraordinary coincidence." But Grace wasn't convinced. She watched as Mark sat beside Richard's hospital bed, blood line running from his arm to a machine that would stabilize the man who had saved their family. She saw the way Richard's hand instinctively moved toward Mark's. And then she saw the question flicker across Mark's face. Something more than coincidence. Something closer to blood. That night, Richard awoke briefly, still pale, his voice barely audible. "I never thought I'd meet you," he whispered, eyes watery. Mark leaned closer. "Why do I feel like I know you?" Richard gave a tired smile. "Because part of you does." Then he fell asleep again. Outside in the hallway, Grace paced. Jackson had arrived moments earlier with a manila envelope in his hand. She stared at it like it might explode. "What's that?" "A report," Jackson said softly. "DNA results." "Why did you?" "Richard asked me to run it before the transfusion. Said he had a feeling. A memory. Something from the past." He held out the envelope. Grace took it slowly. Her hands trembled. She opened it. "Read the first line." And sat down on the floor, as the world shifted around her. Grace didn't cry when she read the report. She didn't gasp. Didn't scream. She just sat there on the cold tile of the hospital hallway, reading and rereading the line that changed everything. Paternal match, 99. 98% probability, Richard Whitmore is the biological father of Mark Bennet. Her first thought wasn't about betrayal or secrets. It was about timing. Richard, near death, had finally found the son he lost. And Mark had no idea. When she told Mark, it was quiet. No fanfare. No dramatic music playing in the background, just the quiet beep of machines in the ICU and the soft hum of hope trying to survive in a sterile world. She sat beside him in the waiting room, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The doctor said your blood was a perfect match," she began. Mark nodded slowly. "I figured. Just lucky, right?" She swallowed. "No. Not luck." He turned to her. Richard had a DNA test run. He didn't tell anyone. Not even me. But Jackson gave me the results. Grace pulled the folded report from her coat pocket and placed it in his hands. Mark stared at it. At the name. At the percentages. At the truth. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally. "He's my father." Grace nodded. "Then who?" Mark's voice trailed off. "Who were the people I thought were my parents?" Jackson stepped forward. "That's the last piece of this puzzle," he said. "And I think I've found it." Decades earlier, in a small town hospital during a night no one remembered, there had been a fire. The wing that housed the maternity ward had been evacuated in a hurry. Records lost. Name tags scrambled. Nurses reassigned. Mark Bennett, born that night, had been handed to the wrong family in the chaos. Meanwhile, Richard and his wife, new parents grieving the loss of their own child, who they believed died moments after birth, left with ashes in an urn that held someone else's tragedy. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even negligence. It was confusion, fear, smoke, and the kind of human error that leaves lives shattered for decades. Mark stood in Richard's hospital room that evening, watching the man who had unknowingly saved his life, and almost lost his own doing it. He didn't know what to feel. Love? Anger? Shock? Maybe all of it. But what he did know was this: Richard didn't owe him anything. And yet, he'd given everything. "I don't remember you," Mark said softly, "but something in me does." Richard, still pale, looked up from his pillow. "You don't have to remember," he said. "We start from here." The next morning, Grace found the girls building a "get well" card out of cereal boxes and glitter. They were arguing over who got to draw the sun. She smiled to herself. Because life, however broken, was rebuilding. Not in grand gestures. But in glue, glitter, and second chances. The first time Mark called Richard "Dad," it was unplanned. They were standing on the back porch of the new house, a modest but beautiful country home Richard had gifted them quietly, without ceremony. It had a wraparound porch, a view of the trees, and enough space for 4 growing girls to scream and chase fireflies without waking neighbors. Grace was inside baking banana bread with Mia and Zoe. Richard stood beside Mark, sipping weak coffee, watching the twins through the window. "I don't remember any of this," Mark said. "What I had. What I lost. Even what I loved." "You haven't lost it," Richard replied. "You're standing in the middle of it." Mark smiled, quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "Thanks, Dad." Richard flinched slightly. Not from discomfort, but because the word landed heavier than either of them expected. His eyes glassed over. He didn't reply, just nodded, and that was enough. A few weeks later, Richard's health stabilized. The surgery had taken its toll, but the recovery was steady. Grace visited him daily, usually with at least one child clinging to her hand and a bag of muffins tucked under her arm. One day, Richard handed her a slim binder, tied with a simple ribbon. "What's this?" "A proposal," he said. "Business mentorship program. Family run. Ethical. Profitable, but never at the expense of people. I'd like Mark to run it." Grace blinked. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything. He has your heart and my blood." "That's a good start." Months passed. Seasons turned. Mark, with guidance from Richard, began learning the ropes of business, the kind built not on profit margins, but on purpose. He learned to balance ledgers while helping Grace pack school lunches. He still had gaps in his memory, but the important things, the girls' birthdays, Grace's laugh, where the cinnamon goes in her coffee, those came back first. Richard turned one of the storage barns behind the house into a chapel. It wasn't religious. More of a memory place. photos of his wife, of Grace's family, and one wall where each of the girls placed handprints in paint. "We are all someone's second chance," he wrote above it. Thanksgiving came. The table was long, full. Mark carved the turkey. Grace lit candles. The girls passed rolls like it was a competitive sport. Richard sat at the head, watching, smiling. At one point, he leaned over to Grace. "Funny," he said, "how much changed because of a $10 bill." Grace nodded, eyes warm. "You didn't just give us kindness. You gave us back our lives." He chuckled. "No, Grace. You already had your life. I just helped you see it again." Later that night, when the house was finally quiet and the dishes were stacked high in the sink, Grace stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. Mark joined her. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "It's strange. We started with nothing. And now, this." He took her hand. "We didn't start with nothing. We started with love. And a little hope." She looked at him, really looked. "You came back," she whispered. "I never stopped trying," he said. They stood there in the quiet, stars blinking awake above them, surrounded by the sounds of a life they had rebuilt, piece by piece. Not perfect, but real. And finally, theirs.